Joining me now is Rem Koolhaas. He is, in the judgment of many people, including Philip Johnson, the best architect in the world today, he certainly is having what many architects dream of. It is the opportunity, in a sense, to design a city. He, along with some other architects in Uralil, which is a pivotal new city, an old city which will take on extraordinary new dimensions, and I am pleased to have him at this broadcast at the same time that the exhibit takes place at the Museum of Modern Art, which we just talked about with Terrence Riley. There is, welcome, first of all, there is this sense about you, is that you have moved to the center in architecture, and MoMA is one example of that, the opportunity to do Uralil in a sense, and that it may be, in fact, in part generational. You sort of represent the coming to fore of a new generation.
I guess it's true. I think it's maybe just statistics. The old generations die and new generations of architects are needed, and therefore the focus is on them now.
You see cities, you think different. How do you see cities? What do they mean to you?
I think that maybe one part of our generation, if I talk about a generation, is that we are maybe the first generation of architects who don't see cities as something that they necessarily have to transform, but who can look at cities and endorse them, or can say, well, this is more or less okay, this is more or less interesting, and I consider this city an interesting field to intervene, rather than something that I should scrape clean and then do my own ideal city on it. I think we are interested in the city, we love the city, but we don't want to start from scratch.
What about you personally? What do cities mean to you? What is the magic? What is the lure? What is the excitement, the drama, the soul?
For me, the greatest things about the city is that they accumulate everyone's desires, and that therefore they form the richest, let's say, accumulation of potential for every single being to be himself or herself. I think that is what cities allow more than any other condition, to somehow be who you want to be.
You had an interesting quote in which you said, speaking of potential, you know what I'm coming to, you said something like urbanism is about creating potential, architecture is about exploiting potential.
I think there's something, and that really relates to let's say our work in a very strong way. I was not always an architect. Before I was an architect, I was a kind of writer or a scriptwriter. And what is fascinating for me now that we are involved both in architecture and in urbanism is to discover that they really are totally different things. That architecture tries to define, tries to limit, tries to exclude other possibilities. If you do an architecture, you are forced not only to say what this specific thing is, but by saying what it is, you also exclude everything it cannot be. And I think that is interesting about urbanism. Urbanism is just creating potential, saying this should happen, but maybe this should happen, and this can also happen here. So you simply make a kind of very compact or intense version of things that are possible. You enable something, and then the architect comes and takes something away from that potential that you have accumulated and makes his own exclusive statement. And so therefore I think that urbanism is fundamentally generous, and architecture is fundamentally egotistical in that sense. But it's very interesting to do the two things at the same time, of course.
Terry said that you were, in a sense, at Uralil, you are being an urban planner. Do you see it that way, or are you being an architect?
I think I'm an urban scenario. Yeah. I think I'm a scriptwriter.
I know, you come back to that several times in what I read about you. How does that inform your work? The fact that you have this experience early?
I think what a scriptwriter does is to invent a series or a sequence of events and episodes, and what a good scriptwriter does is to imagine suspenseful sequence, which makes more of his material than you would otherwise think. And I think that in that sense, I don't see architecture or urbanism as fundamentally an issue of design, but also as the imagining of a number of episodes within a building or within a city, and the establishment of kind of relationships between them, or the separation of relationships between them, because connections are very important, but breaks are also very important, or ruptures. And so for me, the two are actually amazingly close in terms of the kind of inner workings of the profession.
Do you return to screenwriting at all? Do you have any?
No. I have not the slightest temptation. Although, as you can see from the kind of thickness of this book, I have occasional inclinations to be a writer.
Yeah. I want to talk about two books, but I want to come back to you. But here are the two. This is Delirious New York, right? 1978 was it?
78.
Yeah. And how would you characterize what's in here? Because it's being reissued with this MoMA exhibit.
I would characterize it as basically I came as a European to Manhattan
In 72, early
in
72.
72. Yeah. And what was fascinating for me is that Europe is the continent where people write manifestos, and once they've written a manifesto, the things they write about never happen. So there's no evidence for the manifesto. In Manhattan, it was the reverse. There was an incredible accumulation of evidence, but nobody had written its manifesto. So in that sense, I think that then, and I would say that is still something we do. We are able to crossbreed in a way a kind of European and an American sensibility, and what was challenging there was to write the manifesto based on the evidence of Manhattan for what the modern city can be. And in that sense, in a way, it is not about real Manhattan, but it's a kind of theoretical construction of what Manhattan can be.
You talked about in there the three great cities: Moscow, New York, Berlin. What are the great cities today, would you say?
I think what is interesting today is to see that maybe greatness in a city is no longer a very attractive quality. You see,
greatness is not an attractive.
Well,
quality.
you can see that
political greatness.
You can see that if a city is great, like Paris is undeniably great, it almost is in a way today a kind of sentence, because it will mean that the city is discovered, that it will have a massive tourism, that it will, in a way, its very identity and its very greatness will tend to kind of fix limitations on it, because Paris is Paris, and exactly because it's so great, it cannot undergo drastic change. I think what is fascinating today is that there's a whole other condition of cities, which in the book I've called generic cities, which are essentially cities without particular qualities, except that they form or accommodate enormous numbers of inhabitants in more or less pleasant conditions. So what is interesting for me is to discover that, where the greatness of a city was used to be given by a very strong identity, I think that what we are witnessing now is that there is a kind of much more dispersed sense of the city, and that maybe the greatest city at this moment can be a city where there is a kind of maximum comfort, and where people are in a way liberated from an overly strong and domineering identity.
Where is that?
I think it's everywhere in the world now, but you could say that a city like Singapore is such a city. You can see basically hovering around the equator. You can say Atlanta is a kind of typical city.
Why haven't you worked in New York and in America? Why have you not built buildings in America?
I was in 78. I was in a very paradoxical and slightly ridiculous situation, because I was famous but had never built anything.
You're famous for what you wrote.
And so I had to retreat to a condition where I could do my own discrete on-the-job training, and where I could make mistakes, and where I could basically learn the profession of architecture, which is fairly difficult. And so I think it's only recently, let's say in the past 5 years, that I have a sense that we know what we're doing. And so therefore now is also kind of really the time that I'm kind of considering and interested in working in America.
By choice, you call your firm the Office of Metropolitan Architecture?
By choice, yeah.
To say what?
Well, basically, to say that we're in office, because that was not very evident in the beginning. Also to say that we are metropolitan and that we are willing to address the metropolitan situation, so that we are not purist by definition, that we are not squeamish by definition, that we can accommodate what exists rather than have a compulsion to start all over again. And architecture kind of speaks for itself. But basically, the name is of course also kind of mini manifesto and keeps us on our toes in a way.
Are you challenging, what notions do you think you're challenging about cities? What shibboleths, what?
I think to some extent there are several things. I think that one of the notions we are challenging is maybe the notion that sometimes interpretation and sometimes analysis is more important than design. I think that
you're challenging that idea.
No, I think that's one thing in which we are challenging let's say the existing doctrines. I think that we are challenging the situation, cities in a way, maybe most strongly by being able to work with the situation as it exists. I think that is in a way our strongest force, to read existing situations in a creative way and then find within them the arguments for connecting new architectures to them. And so this ability to read the existing situation, I would say, is a new thing in my generation, but also something that is particular to our office.
You also believe in part that what's happening to you and what the opportunities you're having in Uralil and other places, in a sense, and the opportunity you have is also focusing a new role on architects in our society, and we can look at the role of architects in terms of revealing secrets of how a society values itself. Am I right?
I think that's extremely true. Yeah, I think that basically architects have been discovered kind of recently in the past 10-15 years, and I think that's a kind of very ambiguous condition, because on the one hand it's great for us, but it also forces architects to be heroic, or we think we are forced now to be heroic, and by the very fact that we are discovered, we have less time to do good architecture because we have kind of incredible commitments outside architecture that are very time consuming. But also I think it becomes harder and harder for us to speak the truth in terms of what our profession discloses about society, because part of what it discloses is, for instance, the complete domination of money. Part of it which it discloses is the complete relativity of quality. Part of it, what it discloses is, in other words, if we would be completely honest, there is also a number of rather painful or stringent disclosures about the society that we could and I think should make. And that is partly also what I'm trying to do in the book, to make some footnotes, to say the least, about the kind of heroic status of the architect at the moment.
In criticism.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. The book you mentioned is small. This is it'll be out in about 3 or 4 months, right?
Yeah,
3 or 4 or 5 months. It's small, medium, large, extra large, and you call it a novel of architecture?
Basically, it's a number of very different kinds of writing. It's diaries, so the many typologies of writing. So, for me, the cumulative effect of it is almost a literary kind of novelistic effect. I hope, but I mean, it remains to be seen whether the readers see it like that.
Yeah. Do you feel, because of the way your own life, you started, your father was a journalist.
Yeah, and a writer. Yeah.
And a writer. You lived in Jakarta when you were
a child, between 8 and 12.
Yeah, you had an extraordinary experience when you went to Paris in '68, which still seems to also influence you and your work.
Yes, I was a journalist at the time. So
at the '68 when we had the rebellion against de Gaulle and I
didn't participate, but I'm very clearly part of that generation.
And what?
Well, what does that mean?
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting generation in the sense that we have I mean, Rolling Stone has put it very well. We are caught in a demographic, in a collective narcissism of a demographic bubble. In other words, we are the biggest generation, and therefore we always think that where we are in the kind of spectrum is the most important moment or the most interesting moment. But anyway, what is interesting in terms of relationship to urbanism and architecture is that we are very sophisticated in terms of what we know about the city, but we also have been very reticent in taking a kind of operational role in the city. And I was very aware of that when I was first confronted through a fluke with kind of being in charge of planning the city of Lille. I looked at our office, 40 fairly young and fairly inexperienced at the time people, and I thought, you know, do we have to plan a city? Aren't other people planning cities? Aren't our uncles, our fathers, our people with more robust nervous systems than our own planning cities? So in that sense, it was a kind of real confrontation with how we were kind of moving in terms of the kind of age spectrum toward roles of greater responsibility.
Rem Koolhaas has been our guest, and we'll be right back. Stay with us.